Patton at the border of the next war. Victory did not arrive like a clean sunrise. It came through smoke, mud, shattered railway stations, hungry civilians, abandoned German helmets, burned-out villages, and roads so crowded with refugees that armies advancing west and east seemed to be driving through the wreckage of an entire civilization. In the spring of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing, but Europe was not being freed into peace. It was being divided before the guns had fully stopped. George S. Patton understood movement better than almost any commander in the Allied armies. He believed war punished hesitation. He believed speed could become a weapon more frightening than artillery. From North Africa to Sicily, from Normandy's breakout to the icy counterstroke toward Bastogne, Patton had treated distance as something to be conquered by will. His Third Army had crossed France with terrifying momentum, smashed into Germany, and forced its way toward the heart of a dying empire. But in the final weeks of the war, the battlefield changed shape. The enemy in front of him was broken. The danger beyond him was political. By April 1945, American troops were deep inside Germany. Soviet forces were closing from the east after years of unimaginable sacrifice and brutality. The alliance between Washington, London, and Moscow still existed on paper, but underneath it lay suspicion, ideology, and fear. Every road taken, every city occupied, every river crossed now carried consequences that reached beyond military victory. Europe was becoming a map of future power. Patton's army moved into Bavaria and toward Czechoslovakia. The landscape was crowded with the strange human debris of liberation. German soldiers surrendering in columns, forced laborers walking without knowing where home was, concentration camp survivors staring at their rescuers with hollow disbelief, civilians trying to decide which army to fear less. For many American soldiers, victory did not feel triumphant. It felt unfinished. Then came the halt. In early May 1945, Patton's forces reached western Czechoslovakia and liberated Pilsen. Prague, still under German control and in the midst of an uprising, lay farther east. Patton wanted to move. His instinct was simple. If the enemy was collapsing and Allied troops could advance, they should advance. To stop before liberating more territory felt to him like surrendering initiative at the very moment victory was within reach. But the decision no longer belonged only to field commanders. The Allied High Command had already agreed on zones and lines of advance with the Soviets. Eisenhower, focused on ending the war without provoking a confrontation between allies, held American forces back from Prague. The Soviets would take the city. Militarily, it was a decision shaped by coalition strategy and the larger agreements of the war. Politically, it became one of those moments that later seemed to carry the shadow of everything that followed. Patton's frustration hardened. He had spent the war fighting Germans. Now he looked east and saw another power moving into the vacuum. He did not trust Stalin. He did not trust Soviet intentions in Eastern Europe. His language about the Soviets was often reckless, sometimes crude, and politically dangerous. Yet his unease reflected a fear already growing inside Western governments, that liberation by the Red Army might not lead to freedom in the Western sense, but to domination by a different system. Patton was not a prophet standing above history. He was a brilliant, vain, impulsive, deeply flawed commander whose instincts could be both sharp and dangerous. He had a talent for seeing military opportunity and a habit of speaking as if politics were an obstacle to be smashed. He could inspire men to impossible endurance, then alienate superiors with the force of his own contempt. He understood armies. He did not always understand the limits imposed by alliances. And now, those limits were everywhere. At headquarters, maps no longer showed only rivers, roads, and enemy positions. They showed boundaries of influence. They showed where American power stopped and Soviet power began. A city might be reachable by tanks and still unreachable by policy. A road might be open and still forbidden. To Patton, that kind of restraint felt like paralysis. To Eisenhower, it was the price of preventing a catastrophic clash with an ally that had just helped destroy Nazi Germany. Both men were looking at the same continent and seeing different wars. For the men on the ground, the distinction was harder to understand. They had crossed oceans, hedgerows, forests, rivers, and minefields. They had watched friends die in fields whose names they could not pronounce. They had been told they were fighting to liberate Europe. Yet in the final hours, liberation became a matter of diplomatic geography. Some towns would see American jeeps, others would hear Soviet tanks. The line between those outcomes could be decided in rooms far from the people waiting in cellars. In Czechoslovakia, joy and dread existed together. Civilians greeted American troops in the West with flags, flowers, exhaustion, and the stunned relief of people who had survived occupation. But farther east, the future was less certain. German authority was disintegrating. Armed groups, refugees, collaborators, resistance fighters, and revenge all moved through the same ruined space. The collapse of one tyranny did not instantly create order. It created a dangerous silence in which new powers arrived. Patton sensed that silence. He had always imagined war as movement toward decision. But in 1945, decision was being delayed, blurred, negotiated. The Germans were defeated, yet the moral landscape seemed to grow more complicated. American soldiers liberated camps and saw evidence of crimes so vast that ordinary language failed. They also saw prisoners, displaced persons, and civilians whose fate depended on nationality, documents, political classification, and the will of occupying authorities. The war had produced categories of suffering so immense that bureaucracy became a second battlefield. Some displaced people feared going east. Some had collaborated. Some had been forced laborers. Some were former prisoners of war. Some were refugees from Soviet-controlled territories who believed return could mean imprisonment, punishment, or disappearance. The Western Allies faced enormous pressure to sort, feed, screen, repatriate, and control millions of uprooted human beings. The result was often chaotic, sometimes humane, sometimes cold, and frequently morally painful. Patton's role in occupation would soon expose his worst political instincts. After victory in Europe, he became military governor in Bavaria for a time. His administration was criticized for moving too slowly in denazification and for retaining some former Nazi officials in practical administrative roles. Patton saw this as necessary order, others saw it as dangerous leniency. His contempt for political cleansing and his blunt comparisons between Nazis and ordinary political party members enraged American leaders. This was the contradiction at the center of him. He could look at Soviet expansion and sense a looming crisis. He could also look at defeated Germany and underestimate the moral necessity of removing Nazi influence from public life. He could be fiercely loyal to his soldiers and dangerously dismissive of civilian political judgment. He could recognize that the next conflict might be forming, while failing to grasp how his own words made him impossible to manage in the fragile peace. By late 1945, Patton was increasingly isolated. The war had made him famous. Peace made him inconvenient. The qualities that had carried him across Europe now became liabilities. Aggression, impatience, theatrical confidence, hatred of restraint. These had value when armies needed to break through German lines. They were far less useful when the United States needed to govern ruins, reassure allies, negotiate with the Soviets, and present moral authority to a devastated world. Patton had been built for pursuit. The post-war order demanded containment. He did not hide his anger well. He believed the Western Allies had given too much ground to Stalin. He believed American strength should not shrink from confrontation. Some accounts of his remarks suggest he even imagined the possibility of turning military pressure against the Soviets, though such talk remained politically explosive and strategically unrealistic. What can be said with certainty is that Patton's anti-Soviet views became increasingly open, and his superiors saw him as a danger to policy. The machinery of command moved against him not with drama, but with procedure. In October 1945, he was relieved of his post as military governor of Bavaria and reassigned to command the 15th Army, a formation largely concerned with preparing a history of the war. For a man who had lived by movement, it was a quiet exile. The maps remained, but the arrows were gone. The tanks were no longer surging toward enemy lines. The great battlefield commander had been placed beside the record of what had already happened. There is a particular cruelty in that image. Patton, who believed history was made by men willing to act, was now surrounded by the documentation of actions already finished. The war he understood had ended. The war he feared was beginning in forms he could not command. Occupation policy, intelligence assessments, diplomatic cables, party structures, borders, speeches, shortages, elections, purges, and the slow hardening of Europe into rival camps. The Cold War did not begin in a single thunderclap. It formed in pauses, arguments, suspicions, and decisions that seemed temporary at the time. It formed when armies stopped along agreed lines. It formed when liberated nations discovered that liberation could mean different things depending on who arrived first. It formed when former allies looked across checkpoints and saw not comrades, but future enemies. Patton stood near that transformation, restless and angry, but not in control of it. His tragedy was not that he alone saw the future. Many saw pieces of it. Churchill warned of Soviet power. American diplomats worried over Eastern Europe. Soldiers on occupation duty felt the tension before it had a name. The tragedy was that Patton interpreted the emerging crisis through the only instrument he truly trusted: force. He knew how to defeat armies. He had far less patience for the slower violence of politics. In December 1945, Patton was injured in a car accident in Germany. He died days later. Almost immediately, rumor attached itself to his death, as rumor often does when a famous man dies at the edge of unresolved history. Claims of assassination and conspiracy have persisted in popular imagination, but credible historical evidence has not established such theories as fact. The documented reality is stark enough. One of America's most aggressive commanders survived the battlefields of Europe only to die after the war, just as the world he had helped shape began turning into something colder. The men who served under him returned home carrying fragments of that confusion. They had won. They had seen camps opened and cities fall. They had watched German armies surrender by the thousands. Yet they had also watched Europe divide. They had seen that victory did not answer every moral question. It sometimes revealed questions that had been hidden by the urgency of survival. Patton's legacy remains uncomfortable because it refuses to settle into one shape. He was not merely the hard-charging genius of armored warfare. He was not simply a reckless militarist. He was not a flawless anti-communist seer. And he was not a man whose every warning can be dismissed because of his arrogance. He was a commander formed by battle, trapped at the threshold between total war and geopolitical struggle, brilliant enough to sense danger, undisciplined enough to become dangerous himself. At the border of the next war, he saw movement where others saw settlement. He saw threat where others still needed alliance. He saw weakness in restraint, while his superiors saw restraint as the only thing preventing catastrophe. History has not made the argument simple. It has only made it heavier. The Americans stopped before Prague. The Soviets entered. Germany surrendered. Europe celebrated. Then the lines remained. And somewhere in that uneasy silence between victory and fear, Patton's war ended. Not with a final charge, not with a clean triumph, but with a map he could no longer move, a future he could not command, and a truth the 20th century would soon make impossible to ignore. The alliance survived the war. Trust did not.